Hello there, how are you tonight? Before we begin tonight's journey into the past, you might want to dim the lights, get comfortable, settle in somewhere cozy, because this story is best enjoyed when the world around you starts getting a little quieter. And if you find yourself enjoying these calm trips through history, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps the channel grow. It ensures you'll always have another slow, slightly boring history story ready whenever sleep refuses to cooperate. Let me know where you're watching from tonight. It's fascinating to see how many different corners of the world gather together to listen to stories, usually while trying to fall asleep. All right, now that the lights are dimmed and you're hopefully getting comfortable, let's travel back to the medieval world. Tonight, we're stepping into the shadowy life of a medieval assassin. In stories and legends, assassins often appear mysterious and almost heroic, silent figures slipping through dark corridors, completing dangerous missions with perfect skill. Cloaked in shadow, they are imagined as almost inhuman, but reality, as you will soon see, was far more complex, far more unforgiving, and far less glamorous. Imagine a world lit mostly by the flickering glow of torches, where the walls of stone castles echo with secrets and whispers. Streets are narrow, cobbled, and often slick from rain or snow, and towns are crowded with merchants, beggars, and guards, any one of whom could spot a stranger in the wrong place. In this world, moving unseen was not merely a skill, it was survival. Medieval assassins were not born heroes. They were trained, shaped, and sometimes broken by a system that demanded perfection. They belonged to secretive brotherhoods, bound by oaths, rituals, and a code of silence that isolated them from the ordinary rhythms of life. Each member learned that a single slipper, whispered word, a careless movement, could undo years of effort and could end in a cell. Kings, princes, and powerful lords employed them as instruments of control, politics, and sometimes vengeance. They were the invisible threads tugging at the fabric of kingdoms, quietly removing obstacles without the public ever knowing their influence. Yet, the life of an assassin was lonely. Every relationship risked exposure. Every emotional tie could be exploited by enemies. The tools of their trade were simple, yet effective: small daggers, hidden blades, poisons carefully prepared, and knowledge of guards, patrols. But it was not the weapon that defined an assassin. It was patience, the ability to wait, to observe, to plan. Some would hide in plain sight for days, learning the rhythm of their target's life. Others would traverse dangerous mountains in silence. And then there was the psychological toll. A medieval assassin was trained to suppress fear, but not to eliminate it. Fear was a constant companion, whispering at the edges of consciousness. It was the faint shiver when climbing a roof. They had to live with the knowledge that discovery meant death, or, worse, a slow, humiliating punishment. But perhaps the most human aspect was the quiet moments between missions. These were fleeting, rare walks in the moonlight. In those moments, the assassin was simply human, craving warmth, comfort, and a life that could never truly exist. Tonight, we will step slowly into this hidden world. We'll explore their origins, their missions, and the burdens they carried. Follow their paths through shadowed corridors and into the hearts of power, where a single mistake could ripple into disaster. This is a story of survival, of fear, of secrecy. Settle in. Let the night deepen. Together, we'll enter the secret life. And perhaps, by the end, you'll understand why it truly sucked to be one. The world we are stepping into tonight is older than most of the stories you've heard about it. Long before kingdoms rose and fell, before castles dominated the horizon, there were whispers of secret groups operating in shadow, bound not by laws, but by loyalty to one another and obedience to unseen masters. This is where the story begins. Origins are always difficult to trace, especially when the earliest records come from those who feared the very existence of these shadowy figures. Imagine the lands stretching from the deserts of the Middle East to the rugged hills of Europe, dotted with cities under siege by ambition. Here, in narrow alleys and hidden chambers, small groups formed brotherhoods whose purposes were secret, their numbers carefully controlled. Some scholars point to the mysterious sects of the 11th century, while others suggest teachers who trained men in arts considered dangerous and sacred. These early orders were not merely about killing, they were about control of knowledge, information, and power. Each member was chosen not because of strength, but because of mind, cunning, and a capacity for patience. In these early days, the assassin orders were highly ritualized, yet hidden behind layers of deception. Recruits were often brought into small, isolated compounds, perched high on cliffs or tucked away in fortified mountain retreats. Here, the first lessons began, not in combat, but in observation. They were taught to read the world in silence. The rhythm of footsteps on a wooden floor, the subtle sway of a lantern, the nearly imperceptible shift in a guard's gaze. The secrecy of these early orders was both their shield and their weapon. Members were forbidden from speaking of their identities. They were trained to answer only to their masters, who themselves were often faceless, known only through coded messages, and the world beyond. Most of it could not be trusted. Every passerby could be a spy, a rival, or a mark. Over time, these orders developed a structure designed to protect themselves from betrayal. Apprentices learned first to observe and mimic, then to move unseen, then to strike when necessary. Rituals of loyalty were drilled into them from the beginning. They were taught that the brotherhood was family, that secrecy was survival, and that the world outside was indifferent. Interestingly, the formation of these orders was often influenced by the politics of the region. Leaders who feared rebellion would sometimes support these groups, providing resources in exchange for quietly influencing the balance of power. By the time we reach the medieval European scene, these assassin orders had begun to spread, adapting to new environments and cultures. Now, they moved through cities, courtyards, and castles, refining techniques for stealth, deception, and precision. The core principles remained unchanged: secrecy, loyalty, patience, and the relentless pursuit of one's task. It is tempting to imagine these early assassins as purely malevolent, shadows haunting the corridors of power. But the reality was more complex. They were instruments of influence in a time when direct confrontation could easily lead to annihilation. Their power lay in subtlety, cunning, and the ability to act unseen, often shaping history in ways never recorded in chronicles. Tonight, as you imagine these beginnings, picture a world where trust was rare and shadows were constant companions. The first assassin orders were more than killers. They were an entirely different kind of human, trained to navigate danger with grace. In the chapters to come, we'll see how these orders evolved from hidden groups to feared names across entire regions. But always remember, even at the very beginning, this was not a life for the faint-hearted. So, as the night deepens, Imagine the first recruits huddled in candlelit rooms, listening to the cryptic words of their masters. The lessons they learned would echo for centuries, and the shadow they cast would stretch far beyond the mountains where they began. By the time medieval society began consolidating power into kingdoms and principalities, the world was a chessboard of intrigue, ambition, and hidden dangers. Castles rose like jagged teeth against the horizon. Armies marched across rivers and forests, and courtiers whispered in halls heavy with torchlight. In such a world, the emergence of hidden political killers, the assassins, was not just inevitable. It was a necessity. Unlike the early orders, which had focused primarily on training, loyalty, and secrecy, the next phase of their evolution was political. Kingdoms were no longer isolated fortresses. They were networks of alliances, betrayals, and unspoken threats. Here, an assassin was not merely a silent killer, but an invisible agent of influence. One wrong word or an unnoticed betrayal could topple a noble house, ignite a war, or shift the delicate balance of power in a region. Picture, for a moment, a dimly lit council chamber. The air smells of burning tallow, parchment, and sweat. Advisors argue in hushed tones while the ruler listens, weighing every subtle inflection and gesture. Somewhere, hidden in the shadows outside the window, an assassin watches. Their presence is unknown, their eyes trained on a single goal. They are patient, calculating, and disciplined, knowing that one misstep could alert guards or ruin months of preparation. Yet, despite the danger, this was precisely where assassins could exert the most influence by shaping events without ever being seen. The rise of these political killers was intertwined with the needs of rulers who lacked full control over their territories. Kings and princes, aware of the fragile nature of loyalty, often relied on these secret agents to eliminate rivals discreetly. Open conflict was costly and unpredictable. An assassin offered precision. They could remove a rival lord, destabilize a rebellious faction, or manipulate events in ways that no army or public decree could achieve. In a sense, assassins became the silent architects of power. But becoming a political killer was not merely about skill with a dagger or the ability to disappear into shadows. It required understanding human behavior, reading intentions, and anticipating consequences. A successful assassin of this era needed patience beyond measure, able to watch a target for weeks or months, noting every routine, every hesitation, and every weakness. They learned to blend seamlessly into their sometimes as a beggar, sometimes as a traveling merchant, and other times as a trusted servant. Their mastery of observation became their greatest weapon. Interestingly, the political nature of their work often meant that assassins had to navigate a web of competing loyalties. A mission ordered by one ruler could conflict with allegiances to another, and mistakes could be fatal. They operated in a space where ethics were fluid and survival required cold calculation. Yet, within this moral ambiguity, the assassins developed their own sense of justice, or at least of necessity. They understood that their lives depended on efficiency, discretion, and the absolute elimination of error. The evolution of these political assassins also coincided with advances in medieval intelligence. Letters and messages were intercepted, spies were planted, and allegiances shifted with the seasons. Assassins became part of this hidden network, learning not only to kill but to gather knowledge and spread misinformation. A successful operation might involve months of preparation, from mapping secret passages to understanding personal habits to cultivating false identities that could withstand scrutiny from inquisitive eyes. Yet, despite their growing sophistication, the life of a political assassin was far from glamorous. The very skills that made them invaluable, their secrecy, discipline, and cunning also isolated them from the world. Trust was a dangerous luxury, and personal connections could be deadly. Many assassins lived in constant tension, moving through cities and castles like ghosts, always aware that one misstep could mean imprisonment, torture, or death. And while they wielded influence over kings and lords, their own lives remained fragile. They were as expendable as the very pawns they helped eliminate. By the end of this period, the figure of the hidden political killer had become firmly embedded in medieval society. They were no longer simply members of secret orders. They were indispensable instruments of power. Entire political landscapes shifted based on their actions, yet the public remained unaware. To the outside world, nothing had changed, but in quiet chambers, history was being shaped by these invisible agents. So tonight, as you imagine these shadowy figures slipping through the corridors of power, remember every whisper of intrigue, every subtle betrayal and unnoticed movement could have been orchestrated by someone trained to exist entirely unseen. These assassins were not just killers, they were manipulators of fate, architects of outcomes, and masters of patience. In a world where time could be both ally and enemy, and as we move forward, we'll see how new recruits were drawn into this dangerous web, how their training evolved to match the escalating stakes of power, and why even the most skilled could never truly escape. The world of the assassin was not a world one stumbled into by chance. There were no posters, no open applications, and certainly no casual introductions. Entry into a brotherhood was an initiation into a hidden world, carefully guarded from those who might expose it or be exposed by it. For the young men and women chosen, it was the beginning of a life where freedom and danger were inseparable companions. Recruitment often began quietly, almost invisibly, in villages, towns, and even noble courts. A master of the Orderon experienced assassin who had survived countless missions would identify potential recruits based not on strength or wealth, but on subtle qualities, keen observation, patience, a calm demeanor under pressure, or a natural curiosity about the world beyond the obvious. It might be a child who noticed patterns others overlooked, a youth who remained eerily silent in tense situations, or a young adult who exhibited an uncommon cleverness in solving problems. These were the seeds of potential that the Brotherhood sought. For the recruit, the first contact was never obvious. A mysterious stranger might appear, a traveling merchant, a scholar, or even a messenger. They watched quietly, tested carefully, sometimes over months or even years. A careless word, a lapse in judgment, or a sign of arrogance could disqualify the candidate forever. The Brotherhood valued subtlety above all else. The ability to move unnoticed was more important than any skill with weapons. Once identified, the potential recruit would often be invited, sometimes gently persuaded, sometimes taken abruptly into the fold. This was the point of no return. Those who accepted the invitation left behind their former lives entirely. Family ties were severed, friends became dangerous distractions, and every aspect of their life became defined by the Brotherhood's strict code. To be recruited was not merely to join a group, it was to be reshaped, almost completely, into a tool of shadow and silence. The process of initiation was as psychological as it was physical. The recruit would first be tested on their obedience and patience. They were subjected to exercises designed to strip away hesitation, fear, and attachment. Early nights were filled with observation exercises, watching guards on patrol, memorizing patterns of footsteps, identifying threats from a distance. They learned to notice the small things, the way a candle flickers across a room, the rhythm of a city, the scent of whetstone. Physical training was intense. The recruit learned to move silently over rooftops, to vanish into crowds, and to climb walls. Every lesson carried the unspoken message: your life now depends on your discipline and your ability to think several steps ahead. Failure was never abstract. A misstep could cost not only the recruit but also the mission, the order, or even lives outside the Brotherhood. But recruitment was not purely about skills. The Brotherhood sought loyalty above all else. Could they keep a secret when their life was threatened? Could they resist temptation when the stakes were high? Could they place the mission above personal desire? These tests often took months, for trust could never be rushed. The methods of recruitment also varied, depending on the region. In the mountains of Persia, young recruits might be trained in secret fortresses. In Europe, they could be quietly drawn from the families of minor nobles or merchants, their talents recognized during mundane routines. But no matter the location, only those who could endure isolation, discipline, and constant scrutiny could survive the induction. Interestingly, not all recruits were willing participants. Some were coerced into service through threats or exposure to dangerous knowledge. Others sought the Brotherhood deliberately, drawn by the promise of power, revenge, or belonging. Regardless of how they arrived, once they entered, their lives were no longer entirely their own. They belonged to the Order. Their value was measured by their ability to serve the mission flawlessly. Even after formal acceptance, the path ahead was treacherous. The first missions were small, controlled, and observed carefully by masters. Success earned respect. Failure earned consequences that were often brutal. By the time a recruit completed initiation, they had been remade into something almost unrecognizable to the world they left behind. A figure who could vanish into night, strike unseen, and navigate a world of intrigue with lethal precision. And so, as we step further into this hidden life, consider the gravity of this beginning. Recruitment was never simple. It was a quiet, patient process that demanded obedience, cunning, and endurance. For those who survived it, the world of the assassin became their home, a realm of shadows where each action could shape history. The gates of the Brotherhood were heavy, wooden, and darkened by centuries of weather. Beyond them, the world the new recruits entered was harsher than any they had imagined. Sunlight was a privilege, not a right, and every corner, every stone, every shadow carried lessons that would shape or break the young lives. The life of an assassin began not with a mission or a weapon, but with training so relentless it tested the limits of mind and body. The first days were almost unbearable. Recruits were forced to rise before dawn, their bodies aching from exercises designed to break fear. They ran barefoot across gravel and cold stone floors, each step a test of endurance and focus. Mist hung low over the courtyards, clinging to the skin and chilling the bones, yet silence was demanded at all times. A stumble, a whisper, or even a glance at a fellow trainee could be met with punishment, reinforcing the rule that hesitation would be deadly. The instructors themselves were figures carved from shadow and discipline. They did not speak much, but their presence instilled constant awareness. Every movement was scrutinized, every reaction measured. Patience was drilled into the recruits through exercises that seemed endless. Hours spent observing guards, memorizing routes, or moving through obstacle courses while imagining every danger that could await them. One of the earliest lessons was learning to control the body completely. Stealth was not simply moving quietly, it was moving naturally while deceiving perception. A recruit learned to walk in a courtyard without leaving footprints in the snow, to scale walls without letting the fingers slip, to slip between shadows as if they were breathing the darkness itself. Strength and agility were honed alongside awareness and control. The assassin's true advantage lay not in the weapon they carried, but in the way they became part of the world rather than opposed to it. Even the mind was a battleground. Recruits were taught to anticipate danger at every turn. Exercises were designed to push nerves to the edge. Sudden sounds, shifting lights, and hidden obstacles forced them to respond instinctively. The most subtle of mistakes was amplified. They learned to endure exhaustion, to control fear, and to accept that suffering was not punishment, but preparation. Each pain endured was another layer of armor, another step toward the silent efficiency the Brotherhood demanded. Training also involved lessons in deception. Recruits practiced blending into the background, assuming different identities, and observing without being observed. They were placed in crowded towns, sometimes tasked with following strangers for hours, unseen, while memorizing patterns of behavior. At times, they were sent alone into villages, under the guise of a harmless traveler, learning that every conversation could contain hidden threats. Every encounter was a test of vigilance, and every lesson reinforced the idea that the world outside would never wait for the assassin. Weapons came later, only after the body and mind were trained to a degree where the weapon could be an extension of intent rather than panic. Knives, short swords, and even hidden poisons were introduced slowly, first as tools of understanding and then as tools of execution. Precision was more important than strength, and control more than aggression. Every strike was practiced with meticulous care. Sleep itself was taught as a discipline. Recruits learned to rest lightly, to awaken at any sound, and to remain aware. The quiet hours of the night were no longer for comfort, they were for observation, reflection, and internalization of the lessons. By the end of these early months, the recruits had been reshaped. Their bodies were lean and precise, their senses alert. They had become creatures of shadow, attuned to the world around them in a way most ordinary people could never imagine. Every lesson and every challenge was a reminder that the world of the assassin required perfection in silence, patience, and observation. And yet, beneath the harsh discipline, subtle bonds formed. Recruits learned to watch each other, to share knowledge silently. Survival depended on mastering both solitude and the understanding that one's skills were part of a greater web of secrecy. The harsh training was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the foundation of survival. In the darkness of early mornings, in the misty courtyards, a new generation of assassins was forged. Their future would demand more than skill, it would demand patience, courage, and an ability to become invisible even when surrounded by life. It was grueling, exhausting, and relentless. And yet it was only the beginning of a life defined by shadows. Once the body had been tempered through grueling physical training, the recruits entered the next stage of their transformation, mastering stealth and patience. In the Brotherhood, strength alone was never enough. Survival demanded the ability to move like a shadow, think like the wind, and wait longer. These lessons were subtle, almost imperceptible, and required endurance, not only of the body, but of the mind. Stealth was more than silence. It was a discipline of perception, a way of existing. A recruit might spend hours moving through empty streets, dense forests, or echoing corridors, each step calculated, each movement measured, even the smallest sound a squeak of leather on stone. A whisper of wind against a branch could unravel hours of preparation. To succeed, the assassin had to become part of the scenery, a presence that might exist yet never be noticed. Observation became the foundation of every lesson. Recruits studied patterns, the timing of guards, patrols, the flicker of torches, the subtle routines of life. Every detail mattered: how shadows stretched across walls, the rhythm of footsteps on distant streets, or the faint sway of a curtain in a breeze. Patience was not simply virtue, it was survival. One misstep, one impulsive movement, and a recruit could be exposed. The exercises extended beyond physical movement into psychological mastery. Recruits learned to manipulate attention, moving in plain sight while remaining unnoticed. They discovered that invisibility was often a matter of perception rather than darkness. Understanding how to blend seamlessly into crowds, the subtle manipulation of what others saw or failed to see, was as essential as any skill with a blade. Patience, intertwined with stealth, became an active discipline. Recruits might spend entire nights perched in hidden alcoves, waiting for the perfect moment. They learned to suppress every instinct, to resist acting too soon, to trust that the careful measurement of time could be more powerful than force. A moment's impatience could destroy months of preparation. A breath taken too early could mean detection. Disguise was another crucial skill. The recruit could become anyone: a merchant in a marketplace, a wandering scholar, or a servant. Each gesture, each tone of voice, each movement was tested for authenticity. The ability to exist unnoticed became inseparable from survival itself. The training environments were deliberately treacherous. Stone corridors that echoed uneven rooftops, slick with rain, dense forests concealing unseen threats. Every surface could betray a step. Every shadow could conceal danger. The lessons were exhausting, both physically and mentally. To succeed, a recruit had to accept invisibility as a state of being, a way of living, rather than merely a tactic. Through these trials, the young assassins began to perceive the rhythm of the world differently. Sounds, movements, and patterns became a language. Shadows offered shelter. Silence carried meaning. Every interaction, every glance, every second held potential danger or opportunity. The recruits were being forged into instruments of precision and influence, capable of navigating a world that ordinary people barely understood. In these quiet, relentless hours, the young assassins became something extraordinary. They were no longer merely students of violence, but masters of observation. They learned that power often came from restraint, and that survival was earned in silence. In the shadows, they discovered that the greatest skill was to remain unseen until the exact moment when action was necessary. In the silent world of the assassin, a weapon was never merely a tool, it was an extension of the body, a whisper of intent, and a means of survival. The young recruits, now tempered by grueling training and mastery of stealth and patience, were introduced to instruments carefully chosen for precision, concealment, and adaptability. Unlike the clashing swords of knights or the heavy maces of soldiers, an assassin's weapons were designed to leave no trace, to strike and vanish, to exist in shadow as much as the assassin who wielded them. Daggers were the first introduction. Small, lightweight, and easily concealed, they were far more than simple knives. A dagger could be hidden in a sleeve, tucked into a boot, or disguised as a mundane object. But mastery of the blade required discipline. Every movement had to be precise, every thrust measured. A dagger could pierce armor gaps, end a life silently, or signal the start of a plan, but only if wielded by hands trained to move with instinct, not impulse. Recruits spent hours learning the subtle balance of weight and control, striking at targets with the speed of thought rather than brute force. Short swords and curved blades followed. These were heavier than daggers, but retained the qualities of stealth and agility. The curved edges allowed assassins to cut with efficiency in confined spaces, moving through crowded hallways or narrow passages where a longer weapon would be cumbersome. Training with these blades emphasized timing, fluidity, and economy of motion. A swing too wide, a misjudged step, and the assassin could become visible, losing the advantage that secrecy and patience provided. Every motion had to flow naturally, as though part of an invisible dance with the environment. Ranged weapons, though less frequent, were equally critical. Bows, crossbows, and throwing knives were used to strike from a distance, though rarely in open battle. Assassins relied on these tools to remove threats quietly from rooftops or hidden alcoves, and often under the cover of darkness. Precision and patience were paramount. One misfire could expose the assassin or alert others to their presence. Even with a crossbow, the lessons of stealth and timing learned in earlier training were inseparable. Every shot demanded calculation and an understanding of the environment. Poison was perhaps the most insidious tool in the arsenal. Extracted from herbs, minerals, or even animal venom, poisons allowed assassins to manipulate death without direct confrontation. Learning to wield poison required meticulous study. A slight miscalculation could kill the wrong person or even the assassin themselves. Doses had to be measured, delivery methods rehearsed, and subtlety ensured. The use of poison was not simply a method of killing. It was a lesson in patience, observation, and the orchestration of events over hours or days. Hidden or specialized weapons reflected the ingenuity of the orders. Small blades that could spring from belts, concealed hooks for climbing walls, or slender spikes for silent strikes. Every device was designed with a purpose and a lesson. Recruits learned to move with these tools unnoticed. A weapon was only as effective as the mind and body behind it. Without mastery of stealth and timing, even the deadliest blade was useless. Weapons were not taught in isolation. Training always paired them with the principles of stealth, observation, and patience. A dagger was useless without the ability to approach unseen. A crossbow was worthless without careful calculation of distance and timing. Even poison required an understanding of the human body, of routines, and of opportunity. Each weapon was a test of the skills learned so far, a measure of whether they could integrate mind, body, and environment into a single lethal harmony. Beyond their practical function, These weapons also carried symbolic weight. They represented the assassin's readiness to embrace danger, to operate in silence, and to act decisively. They were tools of influence in a world that did not reward overt power. While kingdoms amassed armies and nobles displayed swords and shields, the assassin's arsenal was quiet, precise, and invisible, just like the life they had chosen or been chosen for. In mastering these weapons, the recruits came to understand the balance between action and restraint. Force alone could never succeed. Timing, discretion, and subtlety were far more powerful than the strongest strike. Every blade, every arrow, every vial of poison became an instrument of intent, perfectly synchronized with training in patience and stealth. And in the shadows, where these weapons were used, a single motion could ripple through the corridors of power, unseen and irreversible. By the end of this stage, the young assassins had transformed further. They were no longer merely observers. They were active participants, equipped to influence the world. The weapons they carried were extensions of their training, their patience, and their precision. In their hands, death became quiet, deliberate, and invisible, just as they had been forged to be. Within the cold, echoing walls of the fortress, discipline was more than expectation, it was life itself. The Brotherhood of Assassins did not tolerate hesitation or indulgence, because in the shadowed world they inhabited, even a single lapse could mean death. Discipline was not merely about following orders. It was about shaping mind, body, and instinct into a single instrument, precise and unerring. Every action, every breath, every decision was measured against a standard that allowed no exception. Recruits rose before dawn. They performed rigorous physical exercises, stretching muscles and tendons until they moved like water over stone. Each movement had to be perfect. Imperfection, even minor, was noted, corrected, and repeated until it became instinct. The lessons extended to the smallest details: how to tie a knot silently, or how to step without leaving a footprint. Every day reinforced that mastery was only possible through relentless repetition. Loyalty, intertwined with discipline, was equally uncompromising. The Brotherhood demanded absolute obedience to the order and its leaders. Personal ambition or sentiment was a dangerous distraction. A whispered secret or impulsive act could unravel years of preparation. In this world, loyalty was required for survival. Without it, the network of trust necessary for operations would collapse. Meals were taken in silence, with attention to etiquette and order. Even conversation was regulated, limited to matters of necessity. Recruits learned to control not only their actions, but their expressions, their gestures, and the way their eyes moved across a room. The smallest signal could betray emotion or thought, and in the world outside, such signals could be fatal. Training drills reflected this discipline in action. Recruits performed repeated exercises in climbing, stealth, and combat. Mistakes were corrected immediately, often with the weight of consequences made clear through rigorous simulations. Every movement was intended to instill precision, every pause designed to sharpen awareness, reinforcing that success depended on execution. Loyalty was tested in more subtle ways. Recruits were placed in situations where trust and adherence to instructions were critical. They observed senior assassins silently, learning that obedience was a form of intelligence rather than blind compliance. A recruit who followed faithfully learned the unspoken lessons of discretion, patience, and anticipation. The relationship between discipline and loyalty was reinforced in shared hardships. Harsh weather, isolated exercises, and scarce resources forced reliance. Bonds were forged, not in comfort, but in endurance. Loyalty to the brotherhood became inseparable from self-preservation. Each recruit realized that failure was not just personal, it could imperil the entire order. Obedience was both a duty and a form of solidarity. Within the fortress, even rest became a form of discipline. Recruits learned to remain alert during sleep and awaken at the slightest sound. The practice trained them to survive in any environment, ready to respond to threats instantly, no matter the hour. By the time a recruit had internalized these lessons, the transformation was profound. Their body moved with the precision of years of practice. They were no longer mere trainees, they were instruments of shadow, capable of executing orders flawlessly and surviving where others would fail. In the assassin's world, this combination of discipline and loyalty was not optional. It was the essence of existence. The fortress had done its work. Recruits had been stripped of hesitation, reshaped in rigor, and bonded to a code of vigilance. Only the mind forged in discipline and the heart anchored in loyalty could endure the shadows that awaited beyond the gates. The life of an assassin was not merely defined by physical skill or precise strikes. The true burden often weighed invisibly, deep within the mind. Within the shadows, behind the calm composure and disciplined exterior, lay the constant pressure of the choices they were forced to make. Choices that could alter lives, shape politics, or end in disaster with a single miscalculation. This pressure was as real and relentless as any blade. From the earliest days of training, recruits were conditioned to internalize tension. Every exercise in observation and stealth carried an undercurrent of mental strain. They were taught to anticipate danger in every sound, pattern, and gesture. The mind could not rest, for threats were everywhere. The consequences of error were absolute. This mental vigilance, repeated day after day, began to shape a quiet anxiety that lingered long after training ended. The psychological pressure was compounded by the nature of secrecy. Recruits learned to live double lives, outwardly ordinary, yet inwardly alert to threats. Every conversation, every glance, and every routine action could carry meaning or danger. They were trained to read intentions and detect deceit. This constant hyper-awareness created a subtle, persistent tension, a mental shadow that followed them even into sleep. Isolation amplified the strain. In fortress training and later missions, assassins often spent long stretches alone, with little human contact. Silence, once a tool of stealth, became a companion of reflection and, at times, unease. The human mind had to adapt to prolonged solitude. Recruits learned to confront their own thoughts and the weight of responsibility without distraction, transforming mental endurance into a vital skill. Even success carried its own pressure. Completing a mission flawlessly did not grant relief. It only heightened expectations. One's reputation, the trust of the masters, and the anticipation of future assignments hung as an invisible weight. Every action was measured, compared, and analyzed. Self-doubt and second-guessing were constant companions, tempered only by discipline. The moral complexity of their work added another layer of tension. Assassins were agents of influence, often removing targets for political reasons. Each mission required the mental compartmentalization of life and death, action and conscience. Recruits were taught that hesitation could be fatal. They had to navigate the internal struggle between duty and morality. This constant mental balancing act was a weight that never fully disappeared. Mistakes, however small, were magnified in the mind. A misread movement or a missed opportunity could haunt a recruit for days. The psychological training sought to convert these anxieties into focus. Fear was not suppressed but channeled, sharpening awareness. A trained assassin learned to recognize the tension, to accept it, and to use it as a tool rather than a burden. Pressure also came from unpredictability. No amount of planning could account for every variable. Targets could change behavior without warning. Assassins were taught to embrace uncertainty and remain calm under stress that would paralyze ordinary minds. This resilience was forged through repetition and an understanding that chaos was part of the world they had chosen to inhabit. Even the anticipation of capture or death created a constant, underlying tension. Every infiltration carried the possibility of exposure. Recruits learned to carry fear quietly, to let it guide alertness without dominating thought. The mind became a tool of survival. Ultimately, the psychological pressure of the assassin's life was inseparable from their identity. The mind was the field of constant vigilance. An assassin who could endure mental strain and harness tension became unstoppable. Yet, the mind always carried the invisible weight. The knowledge that one misstep could unravel years of training and bring death or failure. This was the true reality of their lives. In learning to navigate this pressure, recruits became observers and masters of tension, capable of operating where the mind was as much a weapon as the blade. By the time an assassin had mastered stealth, patience, weapons, and psychological endurance, the true test awaited: missions. These were no simple tasks, they were carefully orchestrated operations, often ordered by kings, princes, or influential nobles who wielded power behind closed doors. To the outside world, the kingdom might appear orderly, governed by law and protocol. Yet, in the shadows, every decision could be manipulated by assassins. Assignments were rarely explained fully. A leader might issue a directive through a trusted intermediary, a scroll, or a coded message. Targets could range from rebellious nobles and rival advisors to traitorous generals or those whose influence threatened the balance of power. Motivation was almost always political: maintaining authority, eliminating threats, or destabilizing opposition. Personal ethics mattered little. The assassin's loyalty was to the order and the mission itself, not to the whims of morality. Preparation was meticulous. An assassin studied the target with the same intensity applied to fortress training, mapping routines and observing habits. Every corridor, gate, and alleyway became part of the plan. Every sound, shadow, and interaction held potential information. The missions required more than action, they demanded foresight. Timing, patience, and precision were essential. A single error could reveal the assassin's presence, jeopardize the mission, and imperil the entire order. Assignments from powerful leaders carried a unique weight. Unlike ordinary crimes, these tasks shaped the very foundations of kingdoms. A successful operation could prevent rebellion or shift alliances subtly. The assassin's role was invisible, yet truly monumental. One strike could ripple through politics, changing the course of history, without a single observer aware of the hand guiding events. The burden of responsibility was constant, pressing on the mind like a shadow that never lifted. The selection of targets was deliberate. Leaders often relied on intelligence networks to identify threats and vulnerabilities. The assassin became the ultimate instrument of that intelligence. translating observation and information into action. Recruits learned to interpret incomplete data and anticipate deception. Adaptability became as important as physical skill. No plan survived unchanged once put into motion, and even the smallest miscalculation could provoke unintended consequences. Missions also demanded emotional control. Assassins were trained to act without hesitation, without fear, and without attachment. To falter or to react with anger or mercy could compromise years of preparation. Each strike required total clarity of mind. In this sense, the assassin's life was an exercise in absolute discipline, where the body and environment moved in perfect synchronization. Often, the directives were deliberately vague to test judgment. An assassin might be told simply to remove a target. The cultivation of observation, patience, and anticipation became essential. Judgment was honed over years of relentless practice. Every choice carried the weight of consequences that extended far beyond the individual. An elimination might be disguised as an accident, a poisoning, or an apparent duel. Discretion was always paramount. The act itself was less important than the perception left behind or, more often, the absence of perception. A perfectly executed mission left no witnesses, no evidence, no indication that history had been nudged by invisible hands. Missions demanded movement through dangerous lands. Assassins traversed forests, towns, and cities, often without allies. Each step required attention. Each pause demanded awareness. Each decision balanced risk and opportunity. The weight of responsibility never lifted. The mission became a living tension, a silent test of every lesson learned. By the time a mission was complete, the assassin had transformed yet again from a recruit into an agent of influence. They existed between worlds, unseen, decisive, and irrevocably connected to events far beyond ordinary perception. In the shadows of powerful leaders, the assassin operated with freedom and constraint, aware that one misstep could erase years of training. Always aware that one misstep could erase all the years of training that had brought them to this point. Once a mission was assigned, the assassin often found that the journey itself could be as dangerous as the target. Traveling across hostile lands required not only stealth and discipline, but an acute understanding of terrain, local customs, and human behavior. Roads that seemed empty could conceal bandits, rival spies, or patrolling soldiers. Forests could provide cover, but also hide predators or treacherous ground. Every step demanded vigilance. The journey began with careful planning. Assassins would study maps, observe weather patterns, and consider the timing of travel. Choosing the right route was critical. A path too obvious invited scrutiny, while one too obscure could isolate the traveler and increase risk. Often, journeys were conducted at night, moving under the cover of darkness. Yet even darkness offered no guarantees. Shadows could betray movement. Moonlight could illuminate a path, and the slightest misstep could alert an enemy. Traveling in secret also required disguise. An assassin might present themselves as a merchant carrying wares, a wandering scholar, or a servant seeking work. Every detail mattered. The manner of walking, the way clothing was adjusted, the tone of speech, even the rhythm of breathing. A single flaw in appearance or behavior could raise suspicion, undoing days of preparation. The greatest skill was to become so ordinary in the eyes of others that nothing about the traveler invited attention. Supplies and tools were carried with careful thought. Weight and noise could betray movement. so only essential items were taken. Water had to be sourced carefully, and meals often consumed sparingly, while constantly scanning the surroundings for potential danger. Even a simple stop to rest could become perilous if overlooked. Every moment demanded the integration of patience, observation, and adaptation. The mental strain of traveling alone or with minimal companions was considerable. Silence became a companion, yet prolonged isolation could amplify fear and uncertainty. The assassin relied on intuition to interpret sounds and subtle environmental cues. A snapping twig, a distant horse's hooves, or a flicker of light could signal a threat or a clue to advance undetected. This heightened awareness was constant, draining, yet essential to survival. Encounters with people were handled cautiously. Markets, villages, and towns were unpredictable. Every stranger could be a potential allure, a hidden danger. Assassins relied on observation over conversation, body language over spoken words, always aware that information could be as lethal as a dagger. Weather and natural obstacles were additional challenges. Rain could turn roads into mud, storms could mask movement or expose it unexpectedly. The assassin learned to use the environment strategically: shadows for concealment, wind to carry noise away, terrain to mask footprints. Adaptability became as critical as patience. Travel was rarely linear. Routes were chosen and abandoned, plans altered as circumstances shifted, and improvisation became necessary. Learning to make swift decisions under pressure while maintaining invisibility was a constant, delicate balance. Through these journeys, the assassin's connection to the outside world deepened. Travel exposed them to the lives of ordinary people. Each successful journey reinforced patience, resilience, and confidence, while failures served as lessons in humility and caution. Travel itself became a form of training, shaping body, mind, and instincts for the unpredictability of missions to come. By the end of the journey, the assassin had become a master of movement through dangerous lands. In mastering travel, the assassin learned that survival was as much about discretion and patience as it was about skill with weapons. Every journey and every night spent moving silently brought them closer to the precision and control necessary to complete the mission itself. For an assassin, cities were as dangerous as battlefields, though far less predictable. The cobbled streets, bustling markets, and crowded squares offered both concealment and peril. To move unnoticed in such places required more than physical skill. It demanded mastery of observation, patience, and subtle adaptation. Every passerby could be a threat or a distraction, and every alleyway, doorway, or rooftop held the potential for both concealment and exposure. Blending into a crowd began with careful study. The assassin watched patterns of human behavior: merchants calling out their wares, children darting through narrow streets, guards patrolling in pairs or alone. Every gesture, every rhythm of life became a language to decode. A person who walked too quickly, looked too often at others, or moved with unnatural confidence risked standing out. The goal was not to disappear entirely, but to become ordinary, so ordinary that even the sharpest eye would pass by without notice. Disguise played a critical role. Clothing, posture, and mannerisms had to match the assumed identity. A merchant, a beggar, a traveling scholar, or a servant could all serve as plausible covers, but each required more than appearance. The assassin had to inhabit the role completely, adopt the speech patterns, gestures, and even habits of the persona. Every interaction was both a test and a rehearsal for the life of invisibility they had trained for in fortresses. Crowds were not only cover, they were tools. An assassin could move with the tide of people, allowing movement without drawing attention, pushing through a marketplace, blending into a festival, or slipping alongside a group of travelers, created layers of concealment. Yet the same crowds could conceal dangers, pickpockets, rival spies, or sudden patrols. Constant vigilance was required. Eyes had to scan, ears had to listen, and instincts had to anticipate threats before they became tangible. Every step was deliberate, every glance measured. The assassin's mind became a map of the city. Streets, alleys, and rooftops were memorized. A narrow passage could offer a shortcut, a hidden staircase, a vantage point, a shadowed doorway, an instant of concealment. Even the sounds of the city, the clip of hooves, the clatter of carts, were tools for navigation. By interpreting these subtle cues, the assassin could move like water through stone, slipping past dangers unnoticed. Patience was paramount. In crowded streets, the assassin often had to wait for the perfect moment. Acting too soon could reveal presence. Waiting too long could mean losing the advantage. Interactions were minimal, deliberate, and strategic. Every conversation was a rehearsal in subtlety. Every gesture a calibration of normalcy. The assassin learned that ordinary behavior could be the most lethal camouflage. Fog could obscure a figure on a bridge. Rain could mask footsteps. Sunlight could create illusions along walls and windows. The assassin learned to manipulate perception, to use the city's rhythms as an extension of stealth. By the time the assassin had mastered urban blending, they had become part of the city itself, not an intruder, but an invisible thread. Their presence was unnoticed, yet purposeful. Every movement calculated, every interaction muted. In these crowds, the assassin learned that survival was not merely about hiding, it was about becoming a shadow in a living, breathing world. Even the most skilled assassin could never fully escape one simple truth: discovery was always possible, no matter how carefully they moved, how perfectly they blended into crowds, or how patiently they studied their surroundings. The world was unpredictable. A single glance from the wrong person, a misplaced step on a loose stone, or a guard arriving a moment earlier than expected could unravel everything. For an assassin, this constant risk was not an occasional fear, it was a permanent companion. From the moment they entered a city or approached a target, their senses were stretched to the edge of exhaustion. Every sound had meaning. The scrape of boots on cobblestones, the sudden quiet of a marketplace, the shifting posture of a guard leaning against a wall. These details, insignificant to most people, could signal danger. An assassin learned quickly that people were observant in ways they did not always realize. A baker might notice a stranger passing the same corner too many times. A stable boy might remember a face that seemed slightly out of place. A guard, bored during a long watch, might become curious about a figure lingering near a gate. None of these observations alone meant exposure, but together they could form a pattern, and patterns were dangerous. This is why assassins rarely stayed in one place longer than necessary. Movement was part of survival. If suspicion began to grow, even faintly, it was often wiser to disappear entirely and begin again somewhere else. Missions sometimes required abandoning weeks of preparation simply because the atmosphere had shifted. Patience meant knowing when not to act. Yet sometimes the risk appeared suddenly and without warning. Perhaps a guard recognized a disguise that was not quite convincing. Perhaps a messenger carried unexpected news that altered a patrol route. Perhaps a rival spy noticed subtle movements in a crowd. In those moments, an assassin had only seconds to decide: run, blend in, or improvise. Improvisation was one of the most difficult skills to master. Training could prepare a person for many situations, but reality rarely followed the script. When discovery threatened, the assassin had to remain calm while their mind raced through possibilities. A dropped basket of fruit could create a distraction. A sudden turn into a busy tavern could dissolve a pursuit. A quiet climb to the rooftops could erase a trail entirely. But each choice carried risk. Panic was the true enemy. Panic made footsteps loud. Panic made eyes dart around the room. Panic turned an invisible person into someone suddenly noticeable. So the assassin learned to slow their breathing even when danger was close enough to feel. Calm even when the heart was pounding. Stillness even when every instinct screamed to run. Sometimes discovery came from the target themselves. Powerful nobles and rulers were rarely naive. Many surrounded themselves with layers of guards, servants, and advisors trained to watch. A servant might notice a new face near the kitchens. A guard captain might sense that someone had been studying the walls too carefully, and unease spreads quickly in places of power. When suspicion took root, entire buildings could transform overnight. More guards appeared. Gates closed earlier. Patrol routes doubled. Doors that had once been open became locked and watched. In these moments, assassins relied on the deepest lesson they had learned: patience. Sometimes the correct decision was to vanish, to leave the city quietly before anyone realized what had almost happened. Failure was dangerous, but capture was worse. Capture meant interrogation. Interrogation meant exposure, not just of one assassin, but potentially of the entire order. The thought of this possibility was always present. It lingered like a shadow behind every action, and yet assassins continued their work. They moved through crowded streets and silent rooftops with the understanding that discovery was never far away. Their survival depended on accepting this risk rather than fearing it, because in the shadowed profession they had chosen, perfect safety did not exist. There was only preparation, awareness, and the quiet hope that when danger finally appeared, they would notice it one moment before anyone else did. In the shadowed world of assassins, danger did not always come from guards, watchmen, or suspicious strangers. Sometimes the greatest threat came from far closer, from whispers behind closed doors, from shifting alliances, and from the quiet possibility of betrayal. Politics in the medieval world was rarely stable. Kingdoms appeared powerful, but beneath the surface they were fragile structures held together by loyalty and ambition. Nobles competed for influence. Advisors whispered conflicting strategies. Rivals waited patiently for opportunities to gain advantage. In such an environment, the work of assassins became deeply entangled with political intrigue. A mission was rarely as simple as removing a single individual. Behind every target was a web of alliances stretching across entire kingdoms. One noble might secretly support a rival faction. A trusted advisor might be feeding information to enemies while pretending loyalty to the crown. Assassins operated within this maze of deception, and because of that, trust was always fragile. Even within the Brotherhood itself, secrecy remained absolute. Members knew only what they needed to know for their mission, Orders often arrived through intermediaries, written in coded messages, or spoken quietly in guarded rooms. This structure protected the order. But it also meant that assassins sometimes acted without knowing the full truth behind their assignments. Occasionally, this lack of information hid something dangerous. An assassin might eliminate a target only to discover they were part of a larger plan. A rival lord might use the order's actions to trigger conflict. A king might secretly blame an enemy for a death arranged through shadowy channels. In these situations, the assassin became part of a game far larger than themselves. Political intrigue meant loyalties could shift without warning. A powerful patron could fall from influence overnight, leaving the assassin exposed in hostile territory. Even allies could become enemies when circumstances changed. Every message had to be interpreted carefully. Every instruction had to be considered for the consequences it might create beyond the original target. Because of this, experienced assassins learned to read the subtle language of power. They studied expressions during private meetings. They noticed when guards were unusually tense or when servants whispered nervously in hallways. These small signals could reveal cracks in stability. Betrayal was always a possibility. Sometimes it came from ambitious nobles. Other times it came from rival factions seeking to lure an assassin into an ambush. An assassin had to consider every possibility. Was the target truly the enemy? Was the mission a trap designed to expose the order? In the courts of kings, truth was often buried beneath layers of secrecy. Assassins moved through these environments like silent observers. The Brotherhood existed for a world where warfare was costly and diplomacy fragile. In such a landscape, the assassin was both a weapon and a witness. They saw the hidden tensions beneath royal ceremonies. They understood that behind every smiling noble could stand a carefully concealed enemy. Betrayal was expected. Survival meant accepting that loyalty might crumble and the truth behind a mission might never be fully revealed. All that mattered was discipline, patience, and the ability to move through this web of intrigue without becoming entangled in it. In the silent profession of shadows, distance from ambition was often the only protection left. For all the training, patience, and discipline an assassin possessed, one fear never truly disappeared: the fear of being captured. It lingered quietly in the background of every mission, every journey, every silent step through corridors and crowded streets. Assassins were trained to appear calm, controlled, almost emotionless. But beneath that exterior, they always understood the risk they carried. Capture was not simply failure, it was something far worse. In the medieval world, justice was rarely gentle. If an assassin was discovered and taken alive, they would not be treated as an ordinary criminal. They would be seen as a conspirator, a spy, an enemy working in the shadows against authority. And enemies in the shadows were rarely shown mercy. Interrogation in those times could be relentless. Authorities wanted answers: who had sent the assassin, and whether more danger remained hidden nearby. The prisoner would be questioned repeatedly, for days or longer, as officials tried to uncover the truth behind the attempt. For the assassin, this possibility was always present. It influenced how they planned their movements and how they approached a target. Training did not only focus on stealth or weapons, it also prepared the mind for the terrible reality that a mission might go wrong. A guard might notice the wrong movement, a servant might recognize a face, a door might be locked unexpectedly. Any small mistake could lead to pursuit, and pursuit could end in capture. This constant awareness shaped the assassins' behavior. They avoided unnecessary risks and memorized escape routes before taking a single step. They observed guard patterns again and again, searching for the slightest change. Preparation was their only defense. Even during quiet moments, sitting in a tavern or resting in a rented room, the assassin's mind continued to work. Where were the exits? Which streets offered the fastest escape? Which rooftops could be climbed if soldiers suddenly appeared? These questions never stopped. Living with this level of alertness could be exhausting. Most people moved through life without thinking about danger. But for an assassin, danger was constant. A peaceful evening could turn into chaos in seconds if suspicion arose. And when suspicion spread, the city itself could become a trap. Guards might begin searching strangers. Messengers could ride out with descriptions. An assassin caught had to move quickly and carefully. Escape might involve slipping out before dawn or vanishing into nearby forests before the search widened. But escape was never guaranteed. That is why the Brotherhood trained its members to face capture with mental discipline. Only calm thinking offered even the smallest hope. Some assassins carried tools meant not for attack, but for avoiding interrogation if escape became impossible. To be taken alive could endanger far more than one person. Secrets protected the entire order. If those secrets were revealed, years of careful work alliances, safe houses, hidden routes could collapse overnight. Success meant disappearing without a trace. Failure meant running before the trap closed, and capture meant the end. Because in a world built on secrecy, survival depended on ensuring that no one ever learned who had truly been there. That knowledge, once revealed, could unravel the entire shadowed world. The assassins spent their lives navigating. Failure in the world of assassins was never treated lightly. From the very beginning of training, recruits were taught that every mission carried enormous weight. A single assignment could influence political alliances, destabilize rival factions, or quietly protect a ruler from hidden threats. The consequences of success or failure did not belong only to the assassin performing the task. They often reached far beyond, affecting the reputation and safety of the entire Brotherhood. Because of this, failure had consequences. The Order could not afford carelessness. If one assassin made a mistake that exposed their presence, guards might become suspicious of strangers, and patrols might increase, and powerful leaders might begin searching for the shadowy network operating behind the scenes. A single poorly executed mission could unravel months or even years of careful preparation. For that reason, the Brotherhood maintained strict standards. Punishments were not always dramatic or brutal, but they were always serious. The goal was not simply to discipline the individual, but to protect the secrecy and stability of the entire order. Every member understood this from the moment they joined. When a mission failed without exposure, the consequences were often internal. The assassin might be summoned before senior members and questioned about every detail of the operation. What went wrong? What warning signs had been missed? What decisions could have been made differently? These sessions could last hours. Every movement, every choice, every moment of hesitation was examined carefully. The purpose was to understand the failure and ensure that the same mistake would never happen again. Sometimes the punishment involved additional training. An assassin might be sent back to the fortress to repeat exercises they had already mastered. climbing walls in the cold rain, practicing stealth across echoing corridors, or studying surveillance patterns for days without rest. These punishments were exhausting, but they reinforced the idea that perfection was not optional. Other consequences involved temporary loss of responsibility. An assassin who failed the mission might be removed from active assignments for a time. Instead of traveling through cities and courts, they could be given quieter tasks, like guarding supply routes. These roles were not humiliating, but they were reminders that trust had to be rebuilt. More serious failures, however, carried heavier consequences. If a mission failed in a way that exposed the Brotherhood, the response could become much stricter. A captured assassin who revealed information could compromise hidden safe houses, allies, and communication networks. Such breaches were considered extremely dangerous. The Order could not ignore them. The Brotherhood might impose severe internal penalties, sometimes removing the individual from the Order entirely. In a world where secrecy was everything, a person who could not protect that secrecy became a permanent risk. But perhaps the most powerful punishment was not physical at all. It was the weight of responsibility. Assassins understood that their actions affected others. If a mistake caused increased security, fellow members might struggle to complete their own missions. If a target escaped, that person might strengthen their defenses or retaliate against those suspected of involvement. Failure created ripples, and those ripples could last for years. Because of this, many assassins carried the memory of failed missions with them long after the events themselves had passed. The quiet moments after returning to the fortress could be filled with reflection, replaying decisions and reconsidering movements. These memories became lessons. Over time, experienced assassins developed a deeper understanding of patience, timing, and caution precisely because they had once failed. The Brotherhood believed that controlled failure, properly studied, could strengthen the Order rather than weaken it. Still, the expectation remained clear. Missions were not given casually. Every assignment carried the understanding that success protected the Order, while failure placed it at risk. The pressure followed assassins everywhere through marketplaces, forests, and dimly lit corridors inside powerful castles. In the silent profession they had chosen, there was little room for mistakes, and the consequences of failure were never forgotten. Across the medieval world, there were moments when the quiet work of assassins briefly touched the surface of history. Most of their missions passed unnoticed, their success hidden behind rumors or unexplained events. But sometimes an attempt became so bold, so unexpected, that it echoed through courts and chronicles for years afterward. Stories traveled slowly in the medieval world, carried by merchants, travelers, and wandering storytellers. Over time, these stories grew larger, blending fact with speculation. People whispered about mysterious figures who slipped through heavily guarded palaces. One method involved approaching a target openly. An assassin would infiltrate a court by posing as a messenger, servant, or visiting scholar. Once close enough, they would strike quickly, often using a concealed dagger. This method relied not on speed alone, but on months of preparation. The assassin had to understand the rhythms of the court, who came and went, and how guards were positioned. Even the smallest details mattered: how long audiences lasted, where visitors were received, and which corridors remained quiet at certain hours. Entering a palace meant moving directly into the center of power. A guard might notice unfamiliar behavior, A servant might recognize an outsider. The assassin had to remain calm under intense scrutiny, maintaining the appearance of an ordinary visitor until the final moment. Sometimes these attempts succeeded with astonishing speed. A ruler might collapse suddenly, leaving confusion, while the assassin vanished into the chaos. In other cases, the attempt failed, triggering immediate panic. When failure occurred, witnesses might describe the event in vivid detail. Messengers would ride to nearby cities carrying news. Courts across the region might tighten security, fearing hidden enemies were waiting to strike. A target might be found dead under mysterious circumstances, leaving advisors and rivals speculating how a protected person was reached. Over time, these rumors transformed into myths. Some storytellers claimed assassins could climb impossible walls or vanish into thin air. Others believed they possessed secret knowledge of poisons. In reality, most missions depended on patience, preparation, and precise timing. Kings and nobles began to view the possibility of assassination as a real threat. Guard patrols became stricter. Visitors were questioned more carefully. The fear created by a single attempt could influence behavior for years. For the assassins, these famous operations carried mixed consequences. A successful mission proved even powerful figures were not beyond reach. But increased attention meant increased danger. Every rumor brought watchful eyes. The Brotherhood often preferred their work to remain unnoticed. The most effective missions looked like accidents, illnesses, or unfortunate coincidences. Those events rarely made their way into history books, but occasionally an operation became too dramatic to remain hidden. These moments reminded the world that somewhere beyond the visible structures of power, there existed another force moving quietly in the shadows, a force capable of reaching even the most guarded halls. Rulers began to glance nervously toward the darker corners of their courts. In the medieval world, religion was woven into nearly every part of daily life. People prayed before meals, attended places of worship regularly, and believed that unseen forces guided the events of the world. For assassins living in the shadows of politics and secrecy, belief and faith played a complicated and often deeply personal role. To outsiders, the idea of a killer guided by religious conviction might seem contradictory. Yet in many parts of the medieval world, faith was not separate from duty. It shaped how people understood justice, loyalty, sacrifice, and the meaning of life itself. Assassins were no exception. Within certain assassin brotherhoods, belief became part of the structure that held the order together. Recruits were often taught that their actions served a larger purpose beyond individual ambition. They were not simply acting for wealth or personal revenge. Instead, they were instruments within a broader struggle, one that could involve protecting a community, defending an ideology, or maintaining the balance of power. This sense of purpose was powerful. Training had already demanded extraordinary discipline, secrecy, and sacrifice. Faith offered a framework that helped members accept the harsh reality of their profession. Missions that might otherwise feel morally troubling could be interpreted as necessary acts within a greater plan. In this way, belief acted as a form of psychological armor, allowing assassins to continue their work without being consumed by doubt. Religious symbolism also appeared in rituals within some orders. Initiations, oaths of loyalty, and ceremonies often invoked spiritual language. These practices strengthened unity among members and reinforced the idea that the brotherhood existed for something larger than individual lives. Such beliefs were not always rigid or identical for every assassin. Some members held deep personal faith, viewing their work as part of a sacred duty. Others treated the religious elements more as tradition or structure, focusing primarily on loyalty to the order itself. The medieval world allowed for this complexity. Faith could be both deeply personal and socially shared at the same time. Religion also influenced how targets were chosen and justified. Political power during the medieval period was often closely connected to religious authority. Kings ruled with the approval of spiritual leaders, and disputes between factions sometimes carried religious undertones. As a result, conflicts that appeared political on the surface could also be interpreted as struggles over belief, legitimacy, or divine favor. Assassins operating in this environment sometimes saw themselves as defenders of a cause, not merely agents of violence. Yet belief could also create tension. Different regions of the medieval world followed different religious traditions. When missions crossed borders or involved foreign courts, assassins entered environments shaped by unfamiliar customs and spiritual practices. Understanding these differences became another survival skill. Respecting local rituals, knowing when to remain silent, and recognizing sacred spaces helped an assassin avoid unwanted attention. Religion could also provide opportunities for concealment. Pilgrimages were common in medieval times, with travelers moving between holy sites across vast distances. Assassins occasionally used these journeys as cover for their own movements, blending into groups of worshippers, traveling along established routes. Monasteries, temples, and inns connected to religious communities sometimes offered places where travelers could rest without drawing suspicion. Even in the quiet moments between missions, belief often remained present. Some assassins prayed privately, asking for protection or forgiveness. Others reflected silently on the meaning of their actions, trying to reconcile the discipline of their training with the moral teachings they heard. These moments of reflection did not erase the violence of their profession, but they provided a space where the mind could find balance. The medieval world was full of contradictions, and the lives of assassins reflected that complexity. They were trained to take life with precision and secrecy, yet many still lived within a culture that valued spiritual devotion and moral guidance. In the end, belief served different purposes for different individuals. For some, it strengthened loyalty to the brotherhood. For others, it offered comfort during the long, silent nights of waiting and observation. And for many, it became a quiet reminder that even those who lived in the shadows were still part of a world shaped by faith. In a life filled with secrecy and danger, those small anchors of belief could sometimes be the only things keeping the mind steady. As the centuries passed, the shadowy lives of medieval assassins slowly drifted away from reality and into legend. Stories about them traveled far beyond the places where they actually operated. Merchants carried rumors across deserts and seas. Soldiers repeated dramatic tales around campfires. Travelers told exaggerated stories in crowded taverns late at night. And with every retelling, the assassins became something more mysterious and far less human. In many of these stories, assassins were no longer ordinary people shaped by training. Instead, they became almost supernatural figures. Some storytellers claimed they could climb sheer walls like spiders, scale impossible towers, or vanish into darkness as if they had never been there. Others believed assassins possessed secret potions or poisons that worked instantly, killing powerful rulers without any visible wound. A single sip of wine, a touch on the skin, or even the scent of a flower was said to be enough. These tales fascinated people. In a world of predictable routines, the idea of secret figures quietly influencing the fate of kingdoms captured the imagination. The mystery surrounding assassins allowed rumors to grow unchecked because the truth was rarely visible. Real assassins did not announce their presence. Their missions were designed to leave as little evidence as possible. When a ruler died unexpectedly, or a rival noble disappeared under strange circumstances, people naturally searched for explanations, and often the answer they imagined was an assassin. Over time, the legends grew even stranger. Some stories claimed that certain assassin orders raised children from birth to feel no fear or pain. Others insisted that members were completely loyal to their leaders, willing to sacrifice their lives instantly without hesitation. In reality, the truth was more complicated. Assassins were not emotionless creatures. They were human beings who endured intense training and immense pressure. They felt fear, doubt, and exhaustion like anyone else. Their skill came not from supernatural powers, but from patience, preparation, and the ability to remain calm under dangerous conditions. But stories rarely favored simple explanations. Myths were easier to remember than reality. In some regions, the word assassin itself became surrounded by mystery. People debated where the term had originated. Scholars wrote accounts describing shadowy brotherhoods hidden within mountains, mixing real observations with dramatic imagination. Even rulers and nobles sometimes believed these exaggerated tales. A king might double his guards, install new locks, or forbid strangers from approaching too closely. The fear created by legends could influence behavior just as strongly as real threats. In this way, myths became a form of power. The reputation of being unstoppable or unseen made the Brotherhood appear far more dangerous than their actual numbers might suggest. Enemies became cautious, rivals hesitated, suspicion spread through royal courts, and all of it was fueled by stories. Yet behind the legends remained the quiet truth of the assassin's life, a life of endless training, careful planning, and constant risk. The real work happened in silence, far away from the dramatic tales that filled the imagination of storytellers. Most missions were not dramatic at all. They involved long periods of waiting, watching, and moving carefully through unfamiliar places. They required discipline more than bravery, patience more than speed. The reality was far less glamorous, but far more demanding. Still, the legends endured. Centuries later, people continue to imagine assassins as mysterious figures moving through moonlit corridors, carrying out secret missions that shape the course of history. These images have appeared in stories told around the world, and perhaps that fascination reveals something about human nature. We are drawn to the unknown. We are curious about hidden worlds. The idea that unseen individuals might quietly influence events is both unsettling and compelling. But as we pause for a moment and look past the myths, the real story of the medieval assassin becomes clearer. It was not a life of effortless skill or dramatic heroism. It was defined by discipline, secrecy, and patience, and the understanding that history is often shaped by those who move carefully in the shadows, where almost no one is looking. Between missions, the life of a medieval assassin slowed into something far quieter than the dramatic moments people often imagine. There were no constant pursuits through dark streets, no endless series of dangerous encounters. Instead, long stretches of time passed in patience and routine. For an assassin, these quiet periods were not simply moments of rest, they were essential. Returning from a mission often meant retreating to a safe place, sometimes a fortress belonging to the Brotherhood, sometimes a small house in a distant town. These locations were carefully chosen to provide security and anonymity. From the outside, they looked ordinary, blending into the surrounding world. Inside, life moved at a slower rhythm. The assassin's days were often filled with training, but not the intense physical conditioning of their earliest years. Instead, the focus shifted to refinement. Movements were practiced repeatedly until they became effortless. Climbing techniques were improved, stealth exercises repeated in different environments, and weapons maintained with careful attention. Even the smallest habits mattered. A dagger had to remain perfectly balanced. Clothing needed to allow silent movement. Boots were checked for worn soles that might betray a step on stone. The discipline of preparation never truly stopped. But not every moment was spent in training. Assassins also needed to remain connected to the world around them. Some members worked ordinary jobs between assignments trading goods, assisting merchants, or serving as guides for travelers. These roles helped maintain their cover identities and provided valuable information about local events. Markets were especially useful places. While buying supplies, an assassin could listen to conversations drifting through the air. News of political disputes or reports of increased military activity often surfaced casually among merchants and travelers. Observation remained a constant habit, even during something as simple as walking through a marketplace. The assassin's mind continued to scan who entered the room, which guards patrolled the streets outside. Did anyone seem unusually curious or watchful? These habits had been shaped by years of training and could not easily be turned off. Still, there were moments when the rigid structure of their profession relaxed slightly. Some assassins spent their free hours reading manuscripts, studying languages, or practicing writing codes and ciphers. Others enjoyed quieter activities, sharpening tools, repairing equipment, or simply sitting in silence while the world moved around them. Friendships within the Brotherhood were often reserved but meaningful. Members shared a unique understanding of the life they had chosen. Conversations were rarely loud or emotional, but there was a quiet respect among those who had endured the same difficult training. Stories were sometimes exchanged in low voices, lessons from past missions, clever escapes, or mistakes that had nearly ended in disaster. These conversations helped younger members learn from the experiences of those who had survived longer in the dangerous profession. Despite these small comforts, a certain distance from ordinary life always remained. Assassins rarely allowed themselves to grow too attached. Attachments created vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities could be exploited. A friend who knew too much might expose secrets that had to remain hidden. So even during peaceful days, there was always an awareness that the quiet life might soon change. At any time, a messenger could arrive carrying instructions. A coded letter might appear with news of a new assignment. When that moment came, the calm routine would disappear quickly. Equipment would be gathered, disguises prepared, routes planned. the assassin would step away from the temporary comfort of daily life and return to the silent work that defined their profession. Until then, the quiet days between missions continued. Moments of stillness where the assassin simply waited, watched, and prepared for whatever shadow might call them next. Time moved differently for an assassin. In the early years, life was filled with relentless training, demanding missions, and the sharp urgency of survival. Every movement required strength, every climb demanded endurance, and every moment of danger relied on quick reflexes and clear thinking. Youth gave assassins the physical ability to endure long journeys, scale difficult terrain, and remain alert through nights without sleep. But no one remained young forever. As the years passed, the quiet passage of time began to shape the life of an assassin in subtle ways. Muscles that once responded instantly grew slower to recover. Joints stiffened after long climbs. Nights spent in cold hiding places became harder to endure than they had been in the past. These changes did not happen suddenly. They arrived gradually, almost unnoticed at first. An assassin might realize one evening that a rooftop leap felt slightly more difficult than it once had. A long journey through rough terrain might require more rest than before. The body, after years of strain, began to reveal its limits. Yet aging did not necessarily mean weakness. In fact, older assassins often possessed something younger members lacked: experience. Years of missions had sharpened their instincts. They understood human behavior more deeply. They recognized patterns in politics and power that younger assassins might overlook. While younger members relied on speed and strength, experienced assassins relied on knowledge. They could read a room with a single glance, noticing subtle tensions between nobles or recognizing when a guard was unusually alert. They knew how to predict changes in patrol patterns, how to sense when a plan might be compromised, and when patience would offer a safer path. These insights were invaluable. Because of this, older members of the Brotherhood often took on new roles. Some became instructors, guiding young recruits through the same difficult training they had once endured. They taught not only physical techniques, but also the quiet mental discipline required for survival. Lessons were rarely dramatic. A senior assassin might simply watch as a recruit practiced climbing or stealth, offering small corrections that improved balance, breathing, or timing. These details, almost invisible to outsiders, could determine whether a future mission succeeded or failed. Others became planners and strategists. Rather than traveling constantly, they studied information gathered by agents and scouts. They analyzed political developments, monitored shifting alliances between nobles, and helped determine when a mission was truly necessary. From these quiet rooms, older assassins helped shape the decisions that guided the Brotherhood. Yet, even with these roles, aging carried a certain weight. The life of an assassin was built on secrecy and constant movement. Over time, this meant leaving many parts of ordinary life behind. Families were rarely formed. Friendships outside the order were limited. Personal histories were often hidden or forgotten. As years passed, some assassins began to reflect on the paths they had taken. The quiet moments between missions sometimes grew longer. Sitting beside a dim lamp, sharpening a blade that might never again be used. An aging assassin could feel the distance between their present life and the young recruit they once were. There was pride in survival. Many who entered the Brotherhood never reached old age at all. Missions carried risk, and the world they navigated was filled with danger. to live long enough to teach others or guide the order from behind the scenes was, in its own way, a quiet victory. Still, the profession allowed little room for nostalgia. The world continued to change. New rulers rose to power. Younger assassins took on the dangerous journeys that older members once traveled themselves. Time moved forward, and the Brotherhood adapted. In this way, aging within the Order was not simply about decline, it was about transformation. From the silent figure moving through shadows to the watchful guide helping others learn the same difficult path. And while their steps might grow slower, the knowledge they carried often became the strongest weapon the Brotherhood possessed. Despite all the training, patience, and careful planning, there were moments in history when an assassin's luck finally ran out. No matter how skilled someone was at moving unseen, the world remained unpredictable. A servant might recognize a stranger lingering too long in a hallway. A guard might notice the faint sound of footsteps where none should exist. A disguise that had worked perfectly in one city might fail in another, where customs were slightly different. And sometimes, despite every precaution, the assassin was captured. When that happened, the situation changed instantly. The quiet balance of secrecy and observation collapsed, replaced by suspicion, fear, and urgency. Guards would surround the captured individual quickly, often with weapons drawn, unsure whether the prisoner carried hidden tools or poisons. The moment of capture was often chaotic. Shouts would echo through corridors or marketplaces. Doors might slam shut as soldiers secured the area. Messengers would rush to inform local authorities or the ruler whose safety had just been threatened. Once restrained, the prisoner faced a grim reality. In the medieval world, being caught was considered a serious crime against authority. Rulers needed to demonstrate strength and control, especially if someone had dared to challenge their power in such a direct way. As a result, captured assassins were rarely treated with mercy. Interrogation was usually the first step. Officials wanted to know who had sent the assassin, what organization they belonged to, and whether more conspirators were involved. Information was valuable. This knowledge was worth enormous effort for rulers who feared hidden enemies. For the assassin, however, silence was essential. The Brotherhood's survival depended on secrecy. Members were trained to reveal nothing about their order, their contacts, or their past missions. Maintaining that silence required extraordinary discipline. Some relied on mental techniques learned during their years of training. Many captured assassins remained imprisoned, held in dark cells, while authorities decided their fate. Medieval prisons were harsh places, often damp, cold, and poorly lit. Food was minimal, and contact with the outside world was almost non-existent. Eventually, a trial or judgment would take place. Public punishments were meant to send a clear message. Crowds sometimes gathered to witness these events, curious to see the mysterious figure who had dared to challenge authority. Yet, even in these final moments, many assassins remained quiet. They did not reveal the secrets of their brotherhood. Back within the hidden world of the assassins, news of a captured member would travel quietly through coded messages. The Brotherhood might abandon certain safe houses, change communication routes, or temporarily suspend operations in the region. For those who lived within the Brotherhood, these stories served as powerful reminders of the risks they carried every day. The possibility of capture was always present. Knowing what awaited them made every silent moment in the shadows feel even more dangerous. When we imagine medieval assassins, it is tempting to picture shadowy figures moving through dark corridors, disappearing like ghosts, and performing impossible feats. But the reality was far less glamorous and far more demanding. For anyone without the years of preparation, the life of an assassin was almost impossible to survive. An ordinary person stepping into this world would quickly discover just how relentless it was. The daily existence of an assassin required physical endurance beyond normal limits. Recruits ran for hours, climbed walls slick with rain, balanced on narrow rooftops, and carried heavy weapons across treacherous terrain. Even a moment of exhaustion could be fatal if it coincided with the sudden appearance of guards, rival spies, or other threats. The mind needed to be as disciplined as the body. Assassins were trained to observe every detail, to notice subtle changes in behavior. Ordinary people, untrained to perceive these small cues, would likely overlook danger entirely, or misinterpret a harmless event as a threat, leading to mistakes. Stealth was another barrier. It was not merely about moving quietly. It was a complete understanding of presence, perception, and invisibility. An untrained person would struggle to blend into crowds, remain unnoticed in corridors, or navigate unfamiliar terrain without leaving a trace. Even the simplest mistakes, a scuffing boot, a glance at the wrong moment, or a cough in silence, could expose them to deadly consequences. Fear, too, could become overwhelming. For assassins, fear was managed and converted into focus, a tool to sharpen senses rather than a paralyzing force. An ordinary person, suddenly confronted by the possibility of capture, might panic. In medieval times, capture often meant brutal interrogation or death. The social and psychological isolation of the life added further challenges. Assassins were trained to live with secrecy and detachment. An ordinary person, accustomed to comfort, would quickly feel overwhelmed by the constant vigilance required. The mental strain could break them. Even the tools of the trade required skill. Weapons had to be used with precision, and every device carried its own risks if mishandled. Ordinary people would find it difficult to wield a dagger, throw a concealed weapon, or handle poisons without training. Mistakes could be fatal. Perhaps the most difficult aspect would be the moral weight. Assassins followed orders that could mean taking lives for political reasons. The psychological burden of living with such responsibility, and the knowledge that failure could have catastrophic consequences, was immense. Surviving as a medieval assassin required the combination of years of preparation, relentless training, adaptability, patience, and discipline. It was a life carefully cultivated from childhood. An ordinary person would be unprepared for the extreme demands, dangers, and isolation. The profession was not designed for the average individual. It was a world apart, shaped by necessity, secrecy, and discipline. To step into it unprepared was to step into near certain peril, a stark reminder of just how extraordinary the assassins of history truly were. After traveling through the shadowed corridors, hidden fortresses, and crowded medieval streets alongside these secretive figures, it is easy to forget just how human these assassins truly were. Beneath the legends, the myths, and the whispered stories lay lives defined by discipline, patience, and the constant awareness of danger. Life as a medieval assassin was neither glamorous nor heroic in the way stories often portray it. The work was quiet, repetitive, and demanding hours spent in observation, waiting, or moving carefully through the world without drawing attention. It was a profession shaped by the relentless need to survive while completing missions that could alter the course of power and influence politics. And yet, amidst this tension and secrecy, there were moments of reflection, however fleeting, in the hidden corners of cities, on rain-soaked rooftops, or in the quiet confines of their fortresses. Assassins learned to observe the world within themselves. They understood fear and mastered it. They faced failure and learned from it. They carried out orders and bore the weight of consequences that few could imagine. These lives, full of danger and discipline, were also lives of quiet endurance. Even in the shadows, assassins found routines, moments of solitude, and the subtle beauty of a world that continued moving around them. The sway of trees in a distant forest, the flicker of candlelight in a dark corridor, the gentle murmur of a marketplace all became survival tools. We also see, through their stories, the stark contrast between legend and reality. Myths grew around their deeds, imagining supernatural skills. But the truth was far more profound, skill born from years of careful training and patience. The real power of an assassin came from their ability to act only when the moment was precisely right and to remain unseen. Looking back, one realizes that this life offers a lesson about focus, patience, and the quiet mastery of one's mind and surroundings. It reminds us that survival often depends on preparation, observation, and the courage to remain steady when the world presses close. It also shows that true danger is rarely dramatic. It is often hidden in plain sight, unfolding in ways that the untrained eye might never notice. As we leave the world of medieval assassins behind, it is worth considering the human side of those stories, the endurance, discipline, and subtle intelligence. Their world was harsh and unforgiving, yet also quietly remarkable for the skill, patience, and resilience required to exist within it. And now, as the shadows of history recede, and the streets and fortresses of long-ago cities fade from our minds, it is time to rest. Close your eyes and imagine the quiet nights, the soft footsteps, and the hidden moments where patience and silence reigned. The world of the assassins is distant, unseen, and mostly forgotten, but tonight it has whispered its stories to you. Good night.